For today's video, we'll be returning to Japanese cruisers, and in this case, to a rather successful one, Haguro, a ship that has a couple notable things to her name. One of the longest range torpedo hits in history being one of them, and another in being one of the final surface actions between enemy warships, not just in this war, but in history, as well as the Royal Navy getting one last bit of revenge for the losses they suffered early in the war. Because of this, Haguro has an interesting, if sometimes overlooked story, one that began in quieter times in the mid-1920s. The cruiser was laid down in Nagasaki on March 16, 1925, with the ship launched on March 24, 1928, and commissioned on April 25, 1929. At this point, the world was mostly at peace. Even the Japanese had yet to get really stuck into China. Because of this, Haguro's initial service was pretty uneventful, with the first notable event coming in late 1930 when she carried Emperor Hirohito for 3 days, from October 22nd to October 25th. This was mostly done to transfer him to more luxurious, for a certain value of that word, quarters aboard Kirishima on the 25th. The rest of the 1930s would be occupied with various training exercises and patrol duty. Even when the Japanese went to war in China in 1937, well, not much changed. The cruiser didn't see direct combat, instead escorting troop convoys. About the only thing of major note, aside from her stint with the Emperor, was a major reconstruction in 1936, which is a good point to touch on her overall design as well. As a Miyoko-class cruiser, Haguro displaced around 13,000 tons. This primarily came from 5 twin turrets, each carrying two 20-centimeter or 7.9-inch guns, a super firing pair on the stern, and 3 turrets on the bow. The secondary battery, meanwhile, was 6 single 12-centimeter, 4.7-inch dual-purpose guns, with the obligatory torpedo loadout consisting of 12 fixed launchers in the hull. To protect this, Haguro had a main belt of 102 millimeters or 4 inches and a deck of 50 millimeters or 2 inches. With all of this capable of 35.5 knots on 130,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts, which rounds off the initial design. Now for that 1936 overhaul. This was primarily focused on the weaponry. The main battery guns were torn out and replaced by newer 203mm 8-inch guns, while the secondary battery was replaced by 8 127mm 5-inch guns in 4 twin mountings, and the fixed torpedo tubes were replaced by 2 quadruple launchers carried beneath a new aircraft platform. A further refit in 1939 would increase that number to 4 launchers and 16 torpedoes, in addition to the first 25mm guns being fitted. By the end of the war, the cruiser would have a lot more, though exact numbers are difficult to say for certain. Regardless, that rounds off the design details, and for that matter, the 1930s. As we enter into the 1940s, Haguro would have a much more exciting life, for better or worse. For 1940 and 1941, not much of note happened. Haguro remained close to home, either on training or refit. This would only change in December 1941, as it did for the rest of the Japanese fleet. For Haguro in specific, this meant sailing south on December 2nd to join the planned invasion of the Philippines. Haguro would cover those landings and other operations in the southern Philippines through the end of December. Her guns were certainly getting a workout, albeit a workout against shore targets. It would be a while yet before Haguro got to fight in a surface action. Before that, the new year brought her first taste of American air attack. On January 4th, 1942, Haguro and other Japanese ships were bombed by B-17s flying in from Java. Miyako would be hit, although not badly, by this attack. Haguro evaded any damage. As a result, she remained in the Philippines while Miyako went home for repair, at least at first. By January 9th, Haguro was in the East Indies, supporting landing operations again, first at Celebes on the 9th, then various other landings over the rest of January and into early February. Aside from shooting up shore targets, the closest she came to direct combat was a submarine attack. That came on January 26th when USS Sailfish fired a spread of 4 torpedoes, which failed to hit because neither Haguro or Nachi were damaged by a submarine on January 26, 1942. In fact, they continued right along on their support mission. This would remain Haguro's role until the end of February, when she was reassigned to support the invasion of Java. That came on February 24, 1942. Haguro and the rest of the 5th Division supported the East Java invasion convoy. This would eventually result in the Battle of the Java Sea on February 27, 1942. I'll probably do a dedicated video at some point, maybe sooner than later if there's enough interest. But for today, we'll be focused on Haguro. Alongside her sister Nachi, this ship would be the center of the Japanese forces, right from the start for all intents and purposes. For example, Haguro straddled De Ruyter a few times at the outset, and was in turn fired on by the Allied cruisers to no real effect. The most notable hit from either side's guns was Haguro landing a hit to Exeter. This destroyed 2 of the cruiser's boilers, with a further 4 losing steam pressure. The hit slowed her down and forced Exeter to withdraw, although I should note for fairness that some sources will cite Nachi landing that hit. Soon after this, one of Haguro's torpedoes would claim a Dutch destroyer, Kortenaer. While the exact range isn't clear, it's commonly cited as 22,000 yards, 12.5 miles, or 20 kilometers. Putting this torpedo hit, if that's accurate, in contention with Nizuki's hit on USS Strong for longest range torpedo hit in history. A hit that blew the Dutch ship in two, with the remains sinking in short order. For the remainder of the daylight action past this point, Haguro would continue to engage the Allied forces. However, she made no more notable contributions, not until day had changed to night. After narrowly avoiding attention while recovering her floatplane, Haguro and Nachi stalked their enemy in the darkness. Around 10:30 that night, Haguro landed another torpedo hit, this time to the Dutch flagship De Ruyter, which would ultimately sink the ship, with the loss of Admiral Dorman and 366 other men, or 344 depending on the sources. As for Haguro, she probably escaped damage. Some sources, notably aboard the American destroyers, report a fire aboard, but Japanese sources, to my knowledge, make no mention of this. In any case, Haguro's part of the battle ended. The ship, low on ammunition, left to resupply, before eventually returning to Japan by March 20th, 1942, for a refit. She would still be there when the Doolittle raid came on April 18th. Haguro escaped damage in this and sortied as part of the force attempting to intercept the Americans. Of course, nothing came of that. Haguro would instead return to Japan before sailing on to Truk by April 27th, this time to join up with Shokaku and Zuikaku for the invasion of Port Moresby, or the attempted invasion. This operation would instead result in the Battle of the Coral Sea and severe damage to Shokaku on May 8th. Haguro once more avoided any damage of her own, so she helped escort Shokaku to safety, before returning to Japan herself to prepare for a different invasion, this time directed at Midway Island. Haguro wasn't involved in what became the Battle of Midway, not directly. She would likely have continued her support operations in the planned landings, but this came to nothing. The Kido Butai was wrecked, and the invasion called off. Instead, Haguro would end up supporting operations in the Aleutians at the end of June, before spending July and early August back home, at which point the ship was transferred to Truk on August 17th to help reinforce Guadalcanal in the wake of the American landings, which would see her present for the Battle of the Eastern Solomons on August 24th, 1942. Present, but not performing any particularly notable actions. She at least escaped major damage. For the rest of 1942, and indeed most of 1943, Haguro didn't see much combat. The cruiser would escort convoys, help cover the evacuation of Guadalcanal, and see various refits. Through all of this, the ship only had a few unsuccessful bombing raids to avoid. This period of little action only came to an end on November 2nd, 1943, in the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay. On November 1st, Haguro was assigned to escort 1,000 Army troops to Bougainville in light of the American invasion. This would result the next day in a large surface action. The Japanese lost the light cruiser Sendai and the destroyer Hatsukaze. In the case of Sendai, she was focused by 4 American light cruisers, by now quite adept at using radar-directed gunfire. The old light cruiser was disabled in short order. Hatsukaze, meanwhile, lost her bow in a collision with Miyoko. That left her crippled and eventually sunk by American destroyers under Arleigh Burke. As for Haguro, she avoided any damage again. Alongside Miyoko, the cruiser heavily damaged USS Denver and lightly damaged USS Columbia. Haguro received return fire that damaged her number 2 turret and catapult, among others. 10 6-inch shells, but only 4 actually detonated. Her luck held out, and her luck would continue to hold out later that day when Rabaul was bombed. Despite being a target and famously photographed, Haguro avoided damage. Retreating to safer harbor, the cruiser returned to her old pattern of escorting convoys. This would last into 1944, with the only event of note being another torpedo attack on April 6, 1944. USS Dace attempted to attack Haguro and other cruisers, but she missed. So the next proper combat wouldn't come until June. Haguro helped support Japanese forces on June 19, 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Specifically, she escorted the carrier Taiho, and when Taiho was torpedoed, Haguro became temporary flagship, at least until Admiral Ozawa moved on to the carrier Zuikaku. As for the cruiser, she helped cover the retreat of the Japanese carriers after their air wings were massacred. And as you could probably expect at this point, the cruiser avoided any damage, although her crew claimed 5 American aircraft shot down. At this point, Haguro returned home. She landed her aft torpedo tubes in exchange for bringing her 25mm gun count to 52 barrels. She then returned to quieter duties until October of 1944. Haguro sailed back to her original hunting ground, the Philippines, as part of the center force for the Battle of Leyte Gulf. For the early stage of this, she wasn't damaged. Haguro wasn't torpedoed by Darter or Dace on October 23rd, nor was she hit in the Sibuyan Sea on the 24th. Even at the Battle off Samar on October 25th, Haguro was only lightly damaged. She engaged USS Hull, severely damaging the destroyer, with the crippled ship eventually finished off by battleship gunfire. The cruiser then shifted her fire, damaging USS Fanshawe Bay and Callinan Bay, before Haguro was, in turn, hit by aircraft from Fanshawe Bay, one bomb knocking out her number 2 turret. The Japanese, after emergency repairs, would return and fire at Callinan Bay, as well as Fanshawe Bay. Both carriers were beat up, but ultimately survived. In the air attacks that followed Samar over the next 2 days, Haguro avoided any major damage. This would allow her to return to Brunei by October 28, 1944. Unlike a lot of Japanese ships, the cruiser would remain in the East Indies. Although the last notable event of 1944 was simply towing her crippled sister Miyoko to Singapore from December 18th through December 25th. This came after a refit that removed the guns from her damaged number 2 turret. Which brings us to 1945. For the start of the year, the cruiser remained in port or close to it. The furthest she sailed was Jakarta on April 9th through the 11th to carry troops. Then from May 3rd to the 7th, the cruiser had her torpedo tubes put ashore to make space for food and ammunition. She was going to make another transport run to the Andaman Islands. The first attempt came on May 9th, 1945. On May 10th, Haguro was spotted by the submarine HMS Statesman. With the sighting of the submarine in turn, the cruiser retreated, only to try again on May 14th. This time she would be spotted by aircraft on May 15th, with enemy surface forces spotted the same day, prompting another retreat. This time it wouldn't succeed. Shortly after midnight on May 16th, 1945, Haguro and the destroyer Kamikaze was ambushed. 5 British destroyers attacked and hit the Japanese cruiser with 3 torpedoes, slowing her down and causing a severe list to port. Despite jettisoning supplies, the cruiser was probably doomed. Sources will differ on how many torpedoes she took in the end. I've seen as few as 5 and as many as 10 or more. Regardless, Haguro, suffering from gunfire and torpedoes, ultimately sank with the loss of 751 men. Haguro fought to the end, but it wasn't enough. And as is often the case for wrecks in this area, her hulk has been the victim of extensive illegal salvage. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.